Somewhere past the last marked trail, the map runs out. That's where we live. Out here, there's an old saying. What sees you first follows you longest. So here's the deal. Subscribe and hit that like button, or you're walking back alone. We're chasing 10,000 souls by the end of 2026. Now, let's dive into tonight's story. It's still hungry. You know the Titanic. Everyone does. April of 1912. The ship that couldn't sink. More than 1,500 people lost in freezing black water while the band kept playing right up until the deck went under. Every schoolchild can tell you the name of the captain, the number of lifeboats, the iceberg, but nobody remembers the ship that went down 3 months before her, out in the middle of the Pacific, with no iceberg, no fanfare, and not one official survivor. There's no memorial for her, no museum wing, no plaque, no anniversary. Just a single line buried in an old shipping ledger that reads "Lost with all hands, cause unknown," and a quiet insurance settlement paid out fast enough that nobody had time to ask the wrong questions. I know about her because I was on her, and I'm not supposed to be sitting here telling you this because, officially, there were no survivors. That is always the part people refuse to believe first. Not the creature, not the deaths. That part. They found me 80 miles from where she went down, sunburned so badly my skin was coming away in sheets when they touched me. My lips split and swollen shut from thirst, clinging to a piece of a lifeboat too small and too broken to properly be called wreckage at all. And the fisherman who dragged me out of that water told me afterward that I would not stop talking. Just the same 6 words, over and over, in a voice that did not sound like it belonged to a 19-year-old boy anymore. A voice that had aged decades in a matter of hours. It's still hungry. I want to tell you everything that happened on that ship, from the very beginning, exactly the way I remember it, because I remember all of it, every hour of it. That has always been both my curse and my one useful gift. Even as a small boy, I could recite whole pages back to my mother after she'd read them to me only once, and she used to say I must have been born with a second set of eyes somewhere behind the first, ones that never blinked and never forgot. My father thought it was a fine trick for a boy who might grow up to work in a bank, counting figures nobody else could be bothered to hold in their heads. Neither of them lived to see what that memory would actually be used for. I was the wireless operator aboard her, and in those days a wireless operator needed a sharp memory, more than almost anything else, because half the job was holding an entire message in your head, letter by letter, between the moment the signal came crackling in through the headset and the moment you could get pencil to paper before the next transmission started stepping on the last. I kept notebooks my whole life because of that habit, long before I ever touched a wireless key. I still have some of them now, the ink faded to the colour of weak tea, the pages gone soft as cloth from decades of handling. I could recite entire passages to you from memory if you asked me to, word for word, misspellings and all, because some nights I still do, whether I want to or not. My wife used to wake me gently when I did it in my sleep. She's gone now too. I suppose that leaves only the notebooks and myself, and I would rather empty both of us out onto the page one final time than let this die quietly the way everyone always intended it to. My name is Alaric Penrose. I was 19 years old in January of 1912, and the voyage I am about to describe was my very first crossing of open ocean. I had trained on the wireless sets in San Francisco for the better part of a year, tapping out practice messages on a dead key in a cramped upstairs room above a shipping office until the pattern of dots and dashes started appearing behind my closed eyes whenever I tried to sleep. My instructor was a retired operator named Old Whitfield, half deaf from decades of headsets pressed too tightly against his skull, who used to tell us that the wireless was the closest thing God had ever given men to a nervous system stretched across open water. I thought that was a fine, poetic sort of thing to say at the time. I think about it rather differently now. At the end of that year of training, I was signed onto a private steamer called the Kestrel, bound out of San Francisco for Yokohama, with a hold full of machine parts and a small handful of paying passengers who preferred something faster and quieter than the big passenger liners that ran the same route on a fixed schedule twice a month. She was not famous. She was not grand. She was a solid, mid-sized steamship, iron-hulled, well-kept, with a good captain and a crew that mostly knew its business. Somewhere around 90 souls, total counting officers, crew, and passengers. I remember standing at the bottom of the gangway on a cold, bright morning in January with my trunk at my feet and my heart going so hard in my chest I thought the dock workers nearby must surely be able to hear it, so proud I could barely get a full breath down into my lungs. I had a letter from my mother folded into my coat pocket that I did not open until we were 3 days out because I was afraid that reading it too soon would make me want to turn around and go home before we'd even properly left the harbour. The captain was a man named Gideon Thorne, 58 years old, who'd been going to sea longer than I had been alive. He carried that particular stillness that some high men only earn after 30 years of storms and near misses and long nights where nothing at all goes wrong. The kind of stillness that makes an entire crew relax without ever discussing why. He walked the deck each morning with his hands clasped behind his back, inspecting things that did not need inspecting simply because the habit of looking had never left him, and he greeted every man aboard by name, including men he'd only known for a matter of days. He did not believe in luck. He did not believe in omens, and he said as much plainly and without malice the first week out, when some of the older hands began behaving strangely around a particular stretch of open water that, to my eye, looked exactly like every other stretch of open water we'd crossed so far. The first officer was Cassian Meyer, 37 years old, quieter than the captain, and considerably harder to read. His family had hunted the largest animals in the Pacific for 3 generations, before steam power made the work faster and safer, and he had grown up on ships that chased whales for a living, rather than simply carried cargo past them. He had a particular way of watching open water that the rest of us simply did not have, standing at the rail for long stretches with his jaw set and his eyes moving slowly across the surface as though the ocean itself was writing something out there in a language only he had ever been properly taught to read, and erasing it again before anyone else could catch even a single letter of it. He kept mostly to himself in the evenings, but he was unfailingly kind to the newer hands, myself included, and I came to trust him faster than I trusted almost anyone else aboard. Down in the engine room we had Bram Hallow, 46 years old, built like a doorway, with forearms scarred pale from decades of hot metal and steam. He loved that engine the way some men love their own children, and did not take kindly to anyone suggesting his engine had a single problem he had not already found, and corrected himself, "Thank you very much." He rarely came up on deck except for meals, and even then he ate quickly, as though every minute spent away from his machinery was a minute wasted. I liked him a great deal despite his gruffness, or perhaps because of it, because there was something honest in a man who cared that fiercely about something most people never thought twice about. Among the small handful of passengers aboard was a woman named Elowen Vale, 31 years old, a marine illustrator, travelling east to sketch deep sea specimens for a museum collection that was being assembled somewhere in Asia. She carried a leather case of notebooks nearly as thick as my own, filled with careful, precise anatomical drawings of fish and whales, and strange half-formed things dredged up from depths nobody could properly see into with the naked eye. We fell into conversation on the second day out, leaning on the same stretch of rail near the bow, comparing our matching habit of writing down everything, whether it mattered or not. And within an hour, we were laughing about it the way 2 people laugh when they recognize a piece of themselves in someone else entirely by accident. I think in some other life, we might have become very close friends indeed, given enough time. I choose to believe, even now, that we already were, by the time it ended. There was also a young deckhand near my own age named Toby Wren, 17 years old, on his second voyage after running away from a farm, somewhere inland, that he never much wanted to talk about. He and I fell in together almost immediately. The way two boys thrown into unfamiliar circumstances always seem to find each other. He taught me how to tie a proper bowline in under 4 seconds, and I taught him the wireless alphabet in exchange, tapping it out on the rail with 2 fingers until he could recite half of it back to me from memory, delighted with himself every single time he got a letter right. He is the reason I remember so much of what those first calm days felt like, because a great deal of what I know about ordinary shipboard joy, before everything turned, I know because I was watching it happen through his eyes as much as my own. The first few days passed the way a good crossing is supposed to pass. Fine weather, a steady engine, the ordinary rhythm of shipboard life settling in around me, like a coat I was still learning to wear properly. I sent and received routine wireless traffic, mostly business, for the shipping company, an occasional message relayed on from some other vessel far past the horizon, weather reports, the odd bit of news from shore that I would post on a small board near the dining hall for anyone curious enough to read it. I made notes about the engine's vibration out of pure habit, the way I noted everything, without expecting any of it to matter later. I wrote about the quality of the sunsets. I wrote about a card game that went on for 3 straight nights between 2 of the older sailors, each one convinced the other was somehow cheating without either ever managing to prove it. I wrote about small, ordinary, forgettable things, because I had no way yet of knowing which details would end up mattering and which would not, so I simply kept all of them, the way I always had. It was on the 3rd night that I first heard 2 of the older deckhands speaking low, near the bow, in a mixture of English and something else, a Polynesian dialect I did not understand but recognized the shape and weight of. One of them began to say a particular phrase, and the second man grabbed his forearm hard enough that I heard the slap of it from 10 feet away, and hissed at him to stop, right there. Don't say it out here, not over open water. It hears its own name. I asked Cassian Meyer about it the following morning, since he was the only officer the older sailors seemed to trust enough to speak with honestly. He was quiet a long moment, turning an empty cup slowly between his hands before he finally answered. He told me his grandfather used to speak of something the whales themselves seemed to fear, something old enough that entire migration routes bent themselves around a stretch of ocean rather than ever cross it directly, the way a man will walk 3 streets out of his way rather than pass a house he knows to be cursed. The old sailors called it the Emperor Below, he said, and none of them ever spoke the word shark in the same breath, because to their minds that word was far too small a coat to fit over what they meant. He told me a story his grandfather used to tell, about a whaling ship 2 generations back that had come home short 11 men and refused ever after to speak of what happened during the 3 days they lost contact with the rest of the fleet, and how the captain of that ship spent the remainder of his life refusing to sail past a certain longitude, no matter how much cargo was offered him to do it. I wrote it down, of course. I wrote everything down. At the time, I thought little more of it than a fine story, the kind sailors tell new boys, like me, to pass a long night and see who flinches first. Then, on the 5th day, the ocean went flat. Not the ordinary calm of a fair day at sea. Flat in a way that felt wrong the very moment you noticed it. Glassy from one edge of the horizon to the other, unbroken by anything except the ripple our own hull cut into it. No wind at all. No birds. The kind of stillness that makes your own ears strain forward, hunting for a sound that refuses to come. Captain Thorne remarked on it cheerfully enough at dinner that evening. Called it a fine bit of luck for making good time. And one of the older sailors at the far end of the table went the colour of old candle wax, set down his fork very carefully, and did not touch another bite of his meal for the rest of the night. Toby Wren, sitting beside me, leaned over and whispered that the old man hadn't eaten a full meal in 2 days, not since the water went still, and that he'd caught him praying quietly at his bunk the night before, in a language none of the other deckhands recognised. That was the same night I first noticed the engine change its rhythm. I was on watch in the wireless room, which sat close enough to the engine casing that on a quiet night you could feel its beat through the soles of your boots, the same way you feel your own pulse if you go still long enough to notice it. 5 days in, I had grown so used to that rhythm that it had become like breathing, something my body registered without my mind bothering to comment on it. And then, for perhaps 4 full seconds, it changed. A hitch, a half-beat gone missing entirely, followed by a strange little stumble as it caught itself and smoothed back into its usual pace, as though nothing at all had happened. I checked the clock on the wall. 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. I wrote the time down along with everything else, and told myself it was probably nothing at all. Some debris caught in the intake, a valve settling itself after days of steady running. I went down and asked Bram Hallow about it the next morning, and he looked at me the way a man looks at someone who has just accused him of something shameful. He told me his engine ran clean, and always had, told me he would have felt any fault himself before some wireless boy ever thought to mention it, and sent me back up to my station without much patience left over for further conversation. I let the matter drop. I was 19, new aboard, and had no wish to make myself a nuisance in front of a man who had plainly earned the right to be gruff with me. 2 days after that, Elowin found the whale. It came drifting past off our port side around mid-morning, a grey shape rolling gently in that unnaturally still water, already beginning to bloat in the heat, and half the ship gathered at the rail to watch it pass the way people always do when something dead and enormous drifts near a vessel. Elowin had her sketchbook open before anyone else even thought to look closer, because that was simply how her mind worked, cataloguing carefully even in the middle of something unsettling. She had the wound sketched in under 10 minutes, and when she showed the drawing to me later that afternoon, her hand was trembling slightly, not from fear, exactly more the particular unease of a woman who has just discovered a fact with nowhere left to put it. She told me she had drawn dozens of shark bites across her career, taken from specimens brought up by whalers and fishing crews over the years, and none of them had ever looked like this. The proportions were wrong for anything catalogued anywhere she knew of. Too wide, too deep. The individual marks left behind spaced further apart than anything she had ever measured, even against the largest recorded specimens known to science. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that back in the 1870s, a research vessel called the Challenger had dredged up 2 enormous shark's teeth from deep water far out in the South Pacific, teeth larger than anything any living shark ought to produce, and that quiet talk had circulated in certain scientific circles ever since, about whether something like that might still be moving through water too deep and too cold for anyone to ever properly confirm or deny it. She was careful to say she did not believe it, not exactly. She was too precise a woman to get ahead of her own evidence. But she admitted the wound on that whale had brought those old teeth to mind for the first time in years, and that she intended to keep sketching whatever she found for the rest of the voyage, just in case there was ever a use for a careful record later. I wrote every word of it down the way she'd said it. That night the spray coming up over the rail felt warm against my hand. I don't know how else to put it except that it was not the cold Pacific water I had felt every other night of the crossing so far. It was warm, nearly the temperature of bath water, and it stayed that way in shifting patches for close to an hour, before finally fading back to ordinary cold. I mentioned it to Toby Wren, who was standing nearby coiling a line, and he only nodded slowly, the way a man nods at something he already knows, and had rather hoped nobody would say out loud first. He told me one of the older sailors had started sleeping with a small carved charm tied around his wrist, something his grandmother had given him years ago for a different sort of danger entirely, and that half the crew had started quietly doing the same with whatever scraps of luck they had on hand. A coin, a bit of ribbon, anything at all. Bram Hallow came up from below the following evening, looking like an entirely different man than the one who had waved me off days before. He found Captain Thorne on the bridge, and in a voice pitched low enough that only a handful of us caught it, told him something was striking the hull. Not waves, not floating debris. He described it as slow and deliberate, evenly spaced blows, like knuckles testing a door for a weak spot before deciding how to go through it. He said he had heard it 3 separate times over the past 2 days, always low, always near the same seam close to the engine room. Thorne ordered a full inspection carried out at first light. They found nothing at all, not a dent, not a scored plate, nothing. And somehow that emptiness unsettled Bram far more than any damage would have. He told me later over a hurried meal that a machine which is broken can at least be fixed, but a machine that is perfectly whole and still makes a man afraid to stand near it is a different sort of trouble altogether, one he had no training at all for solving. I was not there for what Captain Thorne saw 2 nights after that, but he told Cassian Meyer, and Cassian told me, because by then the 3 of us had fallen into a habit of trading notes, quietly, off to one side, so as not to spread the fear any further through the crew than it had already spread on its own. Thorne had been alone at the rail near midnight, unable to sleep when something rose beneath the ship, not to the surface, only close enough beneath it that the water bulged and darkened across an area far larger than anything he had charted in 30 years of service, and then it sank away again without so much as a ripple, as though it had simply changed its mind about something. He gave his orders the next morning in his usual steady voice, and only Cassian and I ever knew that his hands were not quite steady around his cup that particular breakfast, though he covered it well enough that most of the crew never noticed a thing. Cassian finally told me the rest of what he had been holding back one evening at the stern, the 2 of us watching our wake fold out behind the ship into that unnervingly calm water. He said this was not an animal trailing us the way a shark follows a vessel out of ordinary hunger, snapping opportunistically at whatever happened to drift close enough. The pattern was wrong for instinct. It had been with us for days without ever once striking. It circled just past sight, letting the crew's fear build and then slowly settle into a kind of exhausted normalcy, the way people always eventually stop fearing a thing that has not yet hurt them. He said his grandfather had described precisely this pattern in old family logs, ships that reported day after day of unnatural calm right before they simply stopped reporting anything at all. Something patient, something that studied the habits of its prey the way a hunter studies a trail, rather than simply following a scent wherever it happened to lead. 3 days before the end, we lowered a boat. Captain Thorne had grown tired of guessing, and against Cassian's quiet objection, he ordered a small boat put over the side at midday, with good light and calm seas, so that 2 experienced hands could row out and take proper soundings near the spot where Bram believed the blows on the hull had been landing. Toby begged to go along, and I remember arguing with him not to, though I could not have told you exactly why, beyond a feeling in my stomach that had no proper words attached to it yet. He went anyway. I stood at the rail with Elowen and watched the little boat pull away from us, growing smaller against that flat, endless water. 2 men rowing steady strokes with Toby perched at the bow, keeping a lookout. They were perhaps 60 yards out when the water beneath them simply dropped away. That is the only way I have ever been able to describe it. Not a wave, not a swell. The surface itself seemed to sink downward, in a wide circle around the boat, as though something enormous just beneath it had drawn in a vast breath, and then the boat pitched hard to one side, and one of the rowing men went straight over into the water with a shout that carried clean across all that stillness to where we stood. Cassian was already shouting orders, men running for lines, and I remember Elowin's hand closing hard around my arm as we watched the second man haul his companion back over the gunwale by main strength, while Toby, God bless that boy, kept his head entirely and began rowing them back toward us alone, with everything he had in his thin 17-year-old arms. They made it back. The man who went in the water came up shaking so badly he could not speak for the better part of an hour. And when he finally did, all he would say, again and again, was that something enormous had passed directly beneath his legs while he was in the water, close enough that he felt the current of its passing pull at his boots, and that it had not touched him at all, had chosen, quite deliberately, not to. Toby told me privately that night, his own hands still trembling as he coiled a line that did not need coiling, that he'd looked straight down into the water as they rowed back and seen something pale and vast turning slowly beneath them, unhurried, almost curious, the way a man might glance up from his supper at a sound in the next room without bothering to get up and investigate it properly. Captain Thorne did not order the boat lowered again after that. He did not have to explain why. Around that same stretch of days, the birds vanished entirely. I noticed it because I noticed everything, and it was the kind of absence that creeps up slowly, instead of announcing itself all at once. For the first 4 days we had gulls trailing the ship on and off, an albatross gliding along behind the stern for hours at a stretch some afternoons. By the 7th day, there was not a single bird left anywhere in that whole flat sky. Just an aching emptiness above us and that warm, patched water below, and a silence so complete you could hear a man's boots on a deck 2 levels down as clearly as if he were standing beside you. A young deckhand went missing from the night watch not long after. Not Toby, thank God. Though I did not breathe easy again until I had counted him with my own eyes at breakfast. Nobody heard a splash. Nobody heard him cry out. His post stood simply empty. Come the morning, his lantern still burning where he had left it, and the length of safety rope he should have been clipped to was found snapped clean through rather than cut, the fibres frayed outward in a pattern that did not match anything a blade could do. Captain Thorne called it a man overboard, an accident, the sort of tragedy that happens at sea more often than anyone likes to admit, and he said it with such conviction that half the crew very nearly believed him outright. I do not think he believed it himself. I think he needed to hear the words out loud to keep the ship from coming apart around him before whatever was truly happening had the decency to finish happening. That was when Thorne stopped pretending, at least among his officers. He doubled the night watch. He ordered every lantern on deck kept burning through what he called the darkest hours, that long stretch before dawn, when even a careful crew grows tired and stops watching as closely as it should, because Cassian had told him plainly that was when it would come, if it came at all. I sent a wireless message that night, trying my best to describe our situation to whoever might be listening somewhere out past the horizon, and I remember sitting with my hand resting over the key for a long, long moment before I finally sent something carefully understated, calling it a possible collision hazard in open water because I was afraid of how the plain truth would sound to a stranger receiving it on the other end of that signal. I was afraid they would think I had lost my mind entirely. I have thought about that choice nearly every day since. I do not know if a more honest message would have changed one single thing that followed. I think about it anyway. The following 2 nights passed without incident, and that absence of incident was its own particular torment. Men stopped sleeping properly. I watched grown sailors, men who had weathered typhoons without flinching, start at ordinary sounds, the creak of a rope, the settle of the hull, the distant call of a man simply changing watch. Toby stopped sleeping in his own berth and began bunking near mine instead, and neither of us discussed it directly. We simply understood that neither wanted to be alone in the dark anymore. Eloin kept sketching, filling page after page with careful studies of the water itself, the strange warm patches, the absence of any bird or fish life anywhere near the hull, because she said afterward that documenting a thing, even a thing you cannot explain, is sometimes the only way left to keep your hands from shaking too badly to be of use. Captain Thorne called a meeting of his officers on the second of those quiet nights, and though I was not properly invited, Cassian brought me along to take notes because he said plainly that if something happened to all of them at once, somebody needed a written record that might survive them. I remember sitting at that small table with my notebook open, listening to grown men who had commanded ships and crews for decades discuss, in careful, measured voices, the possibility that something older than recorded science was hunting their vessel with patient, deliberate intelligence, and that no course correction, no change in speed, nothing within their considerable combined experience, gave them any real confidence of escaping it. Bram Hallow suggested pushing the engine harder, burning through fuel faster than planned to reach shipping lanes with more regular traffic, on the theory that whatever was following them might be less inclined to strike where witnesses were more likely. Thorne agreed. He gave the order that same night. It did not matter. I've come to believe in the long years since that it was never going to matter, that whatever had attached itself to us in that unnatural calm had already decided its own timing days before any of us understood we were being timed at all. The attack came in the hour before dawn, in that dead, warm stillness that had settled over the ship for days like held breath finally released. I want to slow down here because everything that came after happened so fast that I have spent 40 years trying to properly separate it back out into pieces small enough to describe. It began with the smell. That is the part almost nobody ever asked me about, and it is the part I remember most clearly of all. Somewhere, in that hour before dawn, the warm patches of water that had been drifting past the hull for days suddenly thickened into something closer to a smell than a feeling, something like a great deal of iron and salt and old meat, carried up off the surface on no wind at all, because there was still no wind. I was coming off my watch, walking the passage back toward my berth, and I stopped dead in that corridor because my whole body understood something my mind had not caught up to yet. Then the ship lurched. Not the ordinary roll of a wave, a single enormous sideways heave that threw me clean off my feet and into the corridor wall hard enough to split my lip. Down the passage I heard trunks and crockery sliding and shattering, men shouting themselves awake, and beneath all of it, a deep tearing groan travelling up through the deck plates and into my back teeth, a sound I felt as much as heard. I got myself upright and ran, barefoot, still in my nightclothes, and I heard Bram Hallow's voice before I ever reached open air, screaming up the engine room stairwell that they were taking on water fast, faster than any pump aboard could hope to keep pace with. I came up onto the deck into absolute chaos, lanterns swinging wildly on their hooks, throwing long broken shadows across the boards. Men in half-dressed states running in every direction, some towards the lifeboats, some simply running because their bodies had decided to move before their minds caught up. Toby found me almost immediately, grabbing my arm, his eyes wide and his face pale in the swinging lantern light, and neither of us said anything at all. There was nothing left worth saying. And there at the rail stood Captain Gideon Thorne, 30 years at sea behind him, and for the first time in the entire voyage, I saw something on his face that I can only call fear, plain and unguarded, the kind a man stops bothering to hide once hiding it no longer serves any purpose. I followed where he was looking, and I saw it properly, whole for the only time in that entire crossing. A vast pale shape gliding just beneath the surface off our starboard side, longer than the ship carrying us, moving with a silence and a purpose that had nothing frantic or animal in the way it carried itself. No thrashing, no panic, simply an enormous, patient weight sliding beneath us, as though it had all the time remaining in the world, which I have come to believe it very nearly did. And then it struck the stern as well, a second blow landing somewhere below the waterline, and the whole ship groaned again and tipped further off level, and I stopped being able to think clearly about anything beyond the plain fact of staying alive. Cassie and Maya tried to organise the lifeboats with a kind of desperate discipline I believe saved more lives that night than anyone ever properly credited him for afterward. He kept his voice level, even as the deck kept tilting further beneath his own boots, calling out names from memory, herding frightened passengers toward the boats 2 and 3 at a time so nobody rushed the ropes and swamped them before they ever reached the water. He grabbed my shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise I carried for 2 weeks afterward, and shoved me bodily towards the nearest boat, and I remember trying to argue with him, trying to find Toby in the chaos first. And I remember him shoving me a second time harder and telling me in a voice that left no room for a third argument that somebody needed to live through this who could actually explain it properly afterward, and that somebody was going to be me. I found Toby anyway for just long enough. He was helping an older passenger towards a boat on the far side of the deck, and he caught my eye across all that noise and chaos and simply nodded once, the way you nod at a friend when there isn't time left for anything more than that. I have held on to that nod for 40 years. It is the last thing I ever had of him. Elowen would not leave. She had every chance to take an earlier seat and did not take it, staying back instead to help the same older couple toward a boat that was filling fast, guiding them step by careful step across a deck that was no longer anything close to level. By the time she finally turned to look for a place of her own, there was nothing left close enough to reach safely. She found me instead in that last handful of minutes before everything came apart entirely, and pressed her leather case of notebooks into my hands, the whole collected record of that voyage in her own careful sketches, and told me that somebody had to survive this and make people believe what had truly happened out here, because otherwise it would simply vanish the way these things always vanish, written off as a boiler explosion in some company ledger nobody ever bothered to read twice. I never got the chance to thank her properly for that. I've spent the whole rest of my life since trying to be worthy of it instead. Bram Hallow never came up from the engine room at all. I choose to believe he stayed down there trying to keep that engine turning long enough to buy the rest of us a few more precious minutes, because that would have been exactly like him, stubborn to the very last about the one thing in this world he had ever loved, without reservation. Captain Thorne stayed at his post until there was no more deck left under him to stand on, helping the last few passengers into the last boat with his own 2 hands, rather than claim a seat for himself, giving orders in a voice that never once cracked, even as the whole ship groaned and rolled beneath him like a dying animal. I was already in the water by then, thrown clear when our own boat capsized in the crush of the launch, salt water searing into my split lip and into my eyes. And the last I ever saw of him was a dark shape standing against the burning wreckage, still upright, still working. And then the ship went under all at once, and there was nothing left standing to see him silhouetted against anymore. The creature surfaced once more in that firelight, whole and enormous, and I want to be honest with you rather than dress the memory up into something it was not. It did not defy any law of nature that I know of. It was simply overwhelmingly large, the kind of large that makes your mind refuse the scale of it at first, the way you might refuse to believe the size of a building until you have stood directly beneath it and felt your own neck tilt back further than seems reasonable. And then it slid back beneath the surface, and the fires scattered across the wreckage, gutted out one by one, and the ocean went dark and quiet again, quieter than I've ever heard anything before or since in my entire life. I do not remember most of that night in the water afterward. I remember cold, and then, more frighteningly, I remember not being cold anymore, which I later learned is one of the more dangerous signs a body can give a man adrift. I remember calling out names into the dark for a long while, Toby's most of all, and hearing nothing back but the small, ordinary sounds of broken wood and water. I remember something enormous passing beneath me at some point deep in the dark, close enough that I felt the whole weight of the water shift and swell around my legs, and I remember going completely, perfectly still, the way you go still in front of something that has already decided, for reasons entirely its own, not to touch you tonight. It passed beneath me and did not come back. I have never once understood why. I stopped trying to understand it a long time ago, because I have come to believe some questions are not meant to be survived in the answering. I drifted, I was told later, for very nearly 2 full days before the fishermen finally found me, 80 miles from where the Kestrel went down, far further than any reasonable current should ever have carried a man clinging to a broken piece of lifeboat. They said I would not stop repeating those same 6 words. I do not remember saying them, though I believe every account of it, because it is precisely the sort of thing I would have thought until it wore a groove straight through me. A company man came to see me while I was still recovering, in a hospital bed on shore. A thin, tired-looking fellow, with a ledger of his own under his arm. And he asked me a great many careful questions, in a voice that made it clear well before he finished that he had already decided what he intended to write down regardless of what I told him. I described everything as plainly as I could. He wrote very little of it. He thanked me for my time, told me the company was deeply sorry for my loss, and left before I had finished my second cup of water. The shipping company wrote the whole affair off quietly. Not long after. A boiler explosion, their official report said. No survivors listed anywhere on record because a half-mad boy pulled out of the water 80 miles off course simply did not fit neatly enough into anyone's paperwork, and nobody wanted the trouble of amending it properly. 3 months later, the Titanic went down, and the entire world stopped thinking about anything else for a very long while after that, and the Kestrel simply slipped quietly out of memory, the way small tragedies always do when a far larger one follows close behind them. I kept every one of my notebooks. I still have Eloin's sketches too, the ones that survived pressed inside my coat through all that time in the water, faded now but still legible if you know precisely what you are looking for. Still the only proof I have ever held on to that something ancient and patient had been watching our ship for days before it ever chose to strike. I kept, too, a short length of rope that Toby had taught me to tie that bowline knot with. On the second day of the voyage, back when none of us knew yet what any of this was going to cost. I do not know why I kept it. I have simply never once been able to throw it away. Nobody at the company ever believed a single word of what I told them, and after a while I simply stopped telling most people anything at all. I went on to a quiet enough life. I married. I worked wireless stations up and down the coast for years afterward, and later trained younger operators the same way old Whitfield once trained me, though I confess I never once told any of them the real reason I insisted so firmly on the importance of writing everything down, even the details that seemed to mean nothing at the time. I did not think they would believe me either. I'm telling you now instead, because I am an old man, and there are simply not many nights left in which to keep the silence any longer. I still feel that warmth sometimes in perfectly ordinary, cold water, in a lake, a bath, the sea off some quiet beach on a summer afternoon. A sudden patch of warmth that has no business being where it is. And for just a moment I go completely still, and I listen, the way a man listens for an engine about to stutter out rhythm. Because I learned something out there that I have never once managed to unlearn. Something I do not believe the ocean much cares whether we remember or not. It has more patience than any ship ever built by human hands. It can wait through calm water and quiet nights for as long as it takes, until the watch finally grows tired and stops looking as closely as it should. And somewhere out past wherever any chart bothers to mark, I believe with everything left in me that it is still out there, still waiting, still hungry.